we are going to talk about another aspect of anti-Semitism. I am really thrilled to be following this amazing presentation. I think that you'll see that our presentations are complementary. See if I can do this. Okay, so my premise is that people, especially in the United States, are very confused about what really is anti-Semitism. And part of the reason that they're confused is because they're not too sure what Jews are. So it's helpful to look back in time and to see that from the beginning, Jewishness incorporated the sense of a people, the sense of a nation, peoplehood, we sometimes call that. There was a Jewish culture that evolved and a religion. And the culture was partially religious, but it had to do with a lot of other things as well. And today in the United States and in many countries, peoplehood is still central for Jews. Now, peoplehood is a little confusing because if you've been to Israel, you've seen that Jews come in diverse ethnicities. Jews from different countries often look different, and yet they feel like they are part of an entity that's a people. Also, many Jews all over the world today are not religious, but even Jews who don't believe in God at all, they have no doubts about not believing, they still feel attached to the Jewish people. And religious Jews, even religious Jews on surveys say that their connection is primarily the peoplehood connection and belonging to Jewish communities. So if we just look at those three things, at first, the ancient Jews were people from a specific geographical place, people from Judea. And I think that's especially important when we're thinking today about some of the anti-Semitism coming from the left. I'm going to go into that a little more as we proceed through this presentation. But I'm giving you two examples of contemporary anti-Semitism that denies that there were ever Jews in ancient Israel. Arafat and Abbas said the Jews never had a temple in Jerusalem. The Jews never lived in Jerusalem until modern times. And we know from archaeology, we know from many sources outside of Jewish sources that the Jews were in Israel in ancient times, and they had not one but two temples. There's another lie which circulates that says that the Jews didn't even exist until sometime around the Middle Ages or later, that they're all European, they're not Middle Eastern. And that's another kind of anti-Semitism. So one of the things we're going to be doing today is looking at all the different kinds of anti-Semitism. And like Jacob, I believe that we should be focused on what do you do about this? And part of what we need to do about this is to recognize when people are erasing Jewishness and their anti-Semitism is based on the erasure of Jews as a people and Jewishness as a peoplehood and Jews as a tiny minority people. When you look at the number of people of various ethnicities in the world, Jews are among the smallest ethnicity. So while historically, Jews were sometimes persecuted and massacred because of their religion, and in modern times, Jews were persecuted and massacred because of racism, because Jews were perceived as a race, and that race of people was hated. What we're looking at today often is about erasing the concept of Jewish peoplehood altogether. There's a version of Marxist critique which says that any group that has money and high status can't be a minority. They cannot have suffered oppression and genocide. Well, we know that a lot of the Jews that were killed, in fact, during the Holocaust were Jews who were quite assimilated and had achieved financial success, had achieved occupational success, and yet they were carted off to concentration camps and murdered. So when you hear that the world is divided into the oppressors and the oppressed, and Jews are just another kind of oppressors, we need to remember recent history, which shows that if a group is tiny, they are vulnerable, even if they appear to be successful. The second bullet on this slide says that one form of contemporary anti-Semitism says that Jews are not a minority, and since they're not a people and they're not a minority, Jews have no right to national self-determination or having their own country, having a Jewish state, and this ties in very much with the presentation that you just saw. Another form of anti-Semitism, as you see, anti-Semitism is morphed into many different shapes, is Holocaust denial and trivialization. And this is, again, a way of erasing contemporary Jewish history and erasing the minority status of Jews. In the United States, anti-Semitism is not included in many definitions of racial hatred because Jews aren't seen as a minority by some people on the left. And you'll probably remember that Whoopi Goldberg, who's a great person and even identifies as a Black Jew, originally said that the Holocaust wasn't racial hatred because it was white on white murder. In other words, she fell for this lie that Jews are just another kind of white people and they're not distinctive. They don't have their own peoplehood. Later, of course, she retracted that statement. You'll remember that if you watch the January 6th hearings, that a former spokesperson for the Oath Keepers, Jason von Tottenhove, described how when he was a member of the violent group that wants to overthrow the United States government, he heard some of his colleagues over coffee talking about the fact that either the Holocaust never happened or it was greatly exaggerated. And that caused him to leave the Oath Keepers because in his family, one of his relatives has married a Jew, and so he has a Jewish aunt and a Jewish cousin. And what's fascinating about the fact that both Whoopi Goldberg and Jason von Tottenhove's colleague made comments about the Holocaust that kind of diminished it, is that you see that anti-Semitism can come either from the left or the right, and sometimes they are involved with the same kinds of falsehoods. Another example of how confusing it is and how difficult it is for some people to recognize modern anti-Semitism was the episode in January where a terrorist named Malik Faisal Akram took hostages at a synagogue. Okay, this is at a synagogue. And the FBI special agent in charge who came in to deal with this said, well, it's not anti-Semitism, because his concept of what racial hatreds are like is that there has to be something racial about the lies which are told about the people who are being persecuted. And there was nothing specifically racial about what Malik Faisal Akram said. According to a man named Cohen, who was taken hostage along with Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, Faisal Akram said, Jews control the banks, Jews control the government. He believed that if he took Jews hostage, the United States government would release the woman who was imprisoned, and the reason she was in prison, she was a convicted Pakistani would-be terrorist who wanted to kill American soldiers and blow up the Statue of Liberty. Now, she said that Jews were responsible for 9/11, and that Jews were the inside powers in American politics and government. So, because they didn't sound like racial hatred, the FBI at first wasn't going to call it a hate crime because it didn't quite fit their notion of what a hate crime or anti-Semitism is. Eventually, FBI Director Christopher Wray finally called it an anti-Semitic attack. But you can see that this binary of the oppressors and the oppressed doesn't fit the Jewish situation. You can't think that anti-Semitism can't be directed at Jews who are financially successful, because that's part of the hatred. Part of the hatred of Jews is the perception that they have succeeded. Also, there's a kind of anti-Semitism, which, as we saw in the wonderful presentation that preceded mine, is anti-Zionist. And these anti-Zionist ideas circulate among liberal, progressive, educated, younger Americans for a number of reasons. Most of them have no memory of Jews as a disadvantaged and persecuted minority. They don't know a lot about the position of Jews in Europe, Russia, North Africa, and Middle Eastern countries. They know next to nothing about the history of Zionism. They can't remember when Israel seemed to be a tiny, threatened country, still tiny. They are unaware that Jews are a tiny minority. Actually, there's been many surveys which have showed that when people are interviewed and asked, what percentage of your country do you think are Jewish? Routinely, they say a third are Jewish, when in fact, in most countries, except for Israel, we're talking about less than 5%, well under 5%. In the United States, it's less than 2% right now. Many people who fall prey to anti-Semitic ideas don't know that half of the world's Jews live in Israel. And they especially don't know that half of the Jews in Israel are what we might call persons of color, who were oppressed as Jews in the countries where they originally lived. Another form of anti-Semitism, which I actually encountered at an Oxford summer seminar, was articulated by one of the people in the audience. And she said, Israel is different than other countries because other countries were created naturally and organically. But only Israel was created artificially with a lot of violence. And so I created this slide as a response to that version of anti-Semitism. In fact, most countries of the world were created with some kind of conflict. The modern countries of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were created artificially by Western powers after the First World War. India and Pakistan were created during the same time period as Israel, again, artificially. Terrible violence accompanied the creation of many of those countries. There are violent ethnic and religious conflicts right now. And the whole concept that there were countries that kind of like just naturally emerged is mythical. Even America was born through violence in 1776. Israel's certainly not a utopia. Israel has made and continues to make real mistakes, but it needs to be compared to other real countries and evaluated by even standards and realistic standards. So we've seen that erasing Jewish history and erasing pieces of definitions of Jews as a people, a culture, and religion historically attached to Israel are the basis of lies which fuel contemporary anti-Semitism. When you hear people talk about white privileged Jews, you should speak up. Jews are not just a kind of white people. Many Jews are not white, but even the ones who, like me, have freckles, even those are part of an actual peoplehood. And Jews of all skin shades have experienced and still do experience racial hatreds, or hatreds which are defined differently. Jews lived in Israel more than 3,000 years ago. To the extent that they're not indigenous, part of the reason is they were often thrown out of Israel. And the phrase population transfers, Jews were part of population transfers themselves, which is why so few of them remained in Israel. So the whole concept of Jewish colonialists and settlers is inappropriate because Jews have lived in Israel throughout their history. Now, some other forms of anti-Semitism take actual facts and twist them around into conspiracies involving Jews. Here's a fact. 3/4 of American Jews, according to all surveys, are politically liberal, vote Democratic, support civil rights, and are sympathetic to immigrants. The lie that's made out of that is that Jews are purposely bringing in Jews. It's a Jewish conspiracy. Jews are bringing in all kinds of people into the United States, including Muslim people, but also people from South America and Mexico. And their purpose is that they want to weaken the white race. Now, you probably recognize that it's kind of nuts that here Jews are on one hand, the whole Jewishness peoplehood is erased because Jews are white, but they're trying to weaken the white race by bringing in people who are of a different ethnic background. This has been very much popularized by Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who talks about white replacement theory. When you hear those words, white replacement theory, that's another kind of anti-Semitism. Some people who believe in the great replacement theory think that the multimillionaire George Soros is funding the Jewish replacement of white Christians by supporting caravans from South America. There's many versions of that particular lie. The January 6th insurrection was full of anti-Semitism. Many of these violent groups, anti-Semitism is one of their central belief systems. This slide summarizes some of the paraphernalia that they wore or they brought with them, which showed how anti-Semitic they are. But it's not just white supremacists who believe in anti-Semitic falsehoods. Here are some statements from well-known African-American celebrities who have very anti-Semitic beliefs. And again, it's not any one people who are anti-Semitic, but from each group of people, there are those who have anti-Semitic beliefs. You look at the middle bullet here, football star Deshaun Jackson has tweeted out the Jews' plan to extort America and assume world domination. And again, it's so fascinating how people who come from very different backgrounds and who actually hate each other can agree that the Jews are planning world domination, and they have the same anti-Semitic beliefs. Anti-Semitic tropes are used routinely in American political campaigns. Kim Crockett, who's running for Secretary of State in Minnesota, again, blamed George Soros for having everybody on puppet strings And there are a number of these beliefs which are articulated by people who are serving in the American legislature. And meanwhile, leftist anti-Semitism is claiming that Jews are the epitome of whiteness. Jews are the epitome of the oppressors. Whatever they think is wrong with their society is projected onto the Jews, which is a classical anti-Semitic strategy. Classical anti-Semitic strategy is you look at the society you live in, you figure out what you really don't like about it, and then those negative characteristics get projected onto the Jews among you. Now, American Jews are very conscious of the fact that anti-Semitism has increased. Most American Jews do not think people are more anti-Semitic, but they think that non-Jewish Americans feel more free to articulate their anti-Semitism today. And this is anti-Semitism in the United States is shocking to immigrants like Rabbi Shlomo Naginsky, who was stabbed multiple times outside of a Boston area Chabad Lubavitch day camp, which was full of children, saying, I was born in the Soviet Union in the city of St. Petersburg. Never in my darkest dreams did I imagine that I would feel the same way here in the United States, the land of freedom. In terms of who experiences the most anti-Semitism, and again, this is the United States, it may be a different picture in Europe and Middle Eastern countries, but in the United States, younger Jews who are out in workplaces, which are very diverse, experience anti-Semitism mostly in the form of jokes, which are anti-Semitic or being called offensive names, and also ultra-Orthodox Jews who are more visibly Jewish attract the attention of anti-Semites, and many of them have seen anti-Semitic graffiti in their particular neighborhoods. Now, I also am very, very anxious to spend some time talking about what we can do about this. One thing is we need to develop critical skills so that we recognize all these different versions of anti-Semitism. And part of being aware of anti-Semitism is to remember that the Jews are discriminated against, hated, you might say, by both the left and the right. Anti-Semitic statements about Jews, and you can recognize them if they say things that are not supported by verifiable historical fact. And it might be hatred of the Jewish religion that you're hearing. It might be hatred of the Jews as a people. Both of these forms of anti-Semitism still continue today. But there are other forms, as we've discussed this morning, that reject claims that Jews are a historical people. When you hear that, when you hear Jewish people erased, when you hear Jews as a minority group erased, listen for the word minoritized or minoritization. What that means is, even if it's a very tiny group, if they're not financially oppressed and if they're not oppressed in terms of status, they're not really a minority. That's a form of anti-Semitism. It's ahistorical. When you hear that, you should be aware that you're hearing something that in fact hides the actual experience of Jews around the world over the past 100 years. So I put in your hands the charge of paying attention to the realities of Jewishness and the realities of anti-Semitism in all its forms today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia. It was a brilliant presentation and very important. And Jacob, thank you. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. So those who want to ask questions, it'd be best to come sit here so Sylvia can see you. And I would like to start off with a question. I really appreciated your comments and your sort of laying out the landscape of the different forms of contemporary anti-Semitism with an S. I like the fact that you've spent some time looking at who Jews are as a people. And I think Ben's work on the Pride movement and trying to incorporate it into the Jewish community to give Jewish people more pride to fight anti-Semitism is very important. And I think also, we're talking about Black consciousness and Stephen Biko and different types of resistance that go back to their cultural roots to fight, I don't know, not even the appropriation, the kind of the attempt to erase culture and erase notions of people that are colonized or controlled. And there's beautiful concepts in Judaism. We respect the other, we need the other to be human. We accept all people as created in the image of God. We don't impose our belief systems. I think there's very strong concepts of deep humility and profound acceptance that could be a model for fighting all forms of discrimination, in my view. One of the things about Jewish peoplehood is that in Jewish views of who we are, there is not a racialized identity. We're a people, we're a nation. And it's interesting in the last 2 weeks, people trying to unpack American, particularly American racist or racialized identities that is being imposed or reimposed on the Jewish people. We were exterminated for not being white, and now we're the white quintessential, oppressors. Should we not rely on Jewish notions of peoplehood and teach Jews who we are? Because in a sense, in the last couple of weeks, several presenters, brilliant scholars, are kind of putting up images that, there's different hues, there's different races of Jews, and we're still a people. And it's very, I think, there's a footnote, it's very important to have kind of different Jewish cultures, narratives, Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and other Jewish communities are kind of marginalized from the larger Jewish picture of even the Israeli identity, which is shifting. But if we look at racialized identities, and we're telling the American society that we are not just white, we're also brown and Black, are we not feeding into racist identity? Because if you think about it, the Jewish community that was decimated by racism are perceived as white by the anti-Semites in America today. The Ashkenazi Jews were exterminated because they weren't perceived as white. So are we not sort of perpetuating a very narrow racist American perception of identity? That's my question.
Okay, so first of all, one has to remember that there were many Sephardic Jews from Greece and elsewhere who were unfortunately exterminated. I think that the problem you've identified, Charles, is that Jews don't fit into this pre-structured idea of how people are divided. And part of the reason the Jews don't fit into that is that they have this three-pronged identity that I spoke about in the beginning. They are a peoplehood, or actually, if you think about the concept of Am Yisrael, it's sort of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. I think the Jews who live in European countries and in America don't like to use the word nation because they are also patriotic, the countries that they live in. This complicates things. If you care about France, if you care about Germany, if you care about America, then that's why peoplehood caught on. The word peoplehood, that's why it caught on. But even in America and France and Germany, there are Jews of many colors, and there are Jews of many colors in Israel. I don't think it's feeding into, we need to say that Jewish peoplehood is not the same as race, but it is no less powerful. The fact that Jews offer conversion, but never, I shouldn't say never, except for a few small episodes, did not compel conversion. So conversion is not just conversion into a religion. Conversion is conversion into the peoplehood. And we know that if you want to talk about facts, because one of the things that converts are asked to do is to say that they share Jewish destiny. Now, what does it mean to share Jewish destiny? You can think about the biblical story of Ruth. Where you go, I will go. Yes, sharing Jewish destiny. What that means is joining the peoplehood. But I think the comment that Jacob made at the beginning, that it's not all about rational. You can explain this, that the reason there Jews are many different colors is because there were many people who converted into Judaism and they are all part of the Jewish people. They all share Jewish destiny. But I think that that's not going to satisfy people who feel anti-Semitism. I mean, it will satisfy some people whose anti-Semitism is based on cognition. But if it's based on revulsion or emotional things, then correcting the misimpressions is not going to help. I think all we have to do is to always keep repeating that peoplehood is a binding part of Jewishness, but it's not the same thing as race.
So I just very briefly, I agree, but I think in a way we're almost being defensive, and maybe part of the strategy to fight anti-Semitism is to educate the Jewish community of kind of who we are at some level.
Oh, you mean Jews should be educated.
Yeah,
100%.
especially in this
Yes.
case.
Yes.
Okay, many questions. I don't want to take all the time.
Hello, thank you. Interestingly, my question comes from a kind of a, Charles and I are like best friends on this type of conversation. But you spoke to, if someone says that Jews are white, we need to speak up and say something. To me, probably even there's something that's more pernicious than the language is the image. Where there's movies or media. And so what my question is, what kind of steps should be taken to address the default image that's in America as Jews, as white, if we're going to try to debunk the myth that Jews are not a white people? Thank you.
Well, I'm all for using culture as one of our tools. I know that in the congregation that I pray in, there are several families of color who come from different backgrounds. And I think that the more that we can include many different kinds of Jews into cultural portrayals of Jews, that actually can work in more powerful ways than always using kind of lectures and cognition, because when people see that Jews are Black and that Jews are brown and that Jews come from different parts of the world, when they read that in novels, when they see it on their television or movie screens, that I think will help to change the automatic assumption that Jews look and act a certain way.
I just want to chime in, and I agree with Charles. I think. Well, first of all, the word racism is a very, very red button, even more electrifying word in the American context, and it is superimposed on Israel by its detractors. So I think we have to first of all mentally detach ourselves. What's going on is certainly in Israel, it's nothing to do with racism. It's a national, ethnic, religious conflict between two peoples. So I think moving to the word peoples is good. I think totally disconnecting it from the American context is really important. Don't superimpose your issues on Israel, Palestine. And the third thing is talk less. I think that goes with an image is worth 1,000 words. instead of arguing all the time, getting yourself all worked up, so show nice pictures of Am Yisrael and all its beautiful colors.
I think, though, if I might respond to what you just said, the phrase white colonialist Israel shows that you can't actually disconnect American propaganda from the way Israel is perceived. The whole
Yes.
white colonialist thing is about whiteness, has nothing to do with what Israel really is. But universities around the world have spread that kind of image. And I think we need to work in many countries to combat that image.
If I may chime in, I think it can. And the Abraham Accords, sorry, the Abraham Accords is a way through. Yeah. Okay, I'll come over there.
Yeah, thank you. And then Sylvia will be able to hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
You want me to go first? Okay. I guess as an historian, I wanted to add a point about this idea of whiteness. And I would argue that one of the problems with this usage of white is that it's deeply ahistorical. And I write about the later 19th century British context of Christian missionaries, and they don't have category of white. It's not a category they would use. They never use it in their missionary literature. It's just not the way they understand it. I could go on about that, but just to say, not only is it a superimposing American racial categories onto Israel in a way that's not at all useful, but it also is taking categories of the 21st century and imposing them backwards in places where they just don't belong. And white, like it's not a thing. Like white's not like, a hand. A hand is a hand. It's a consistent thing. White is not consistent. It means different things in different places. That was just my comment from an historical point of view, that this usage of white is, I think, really ahistorical and problematic. But my other question is, I wanted to think about like this idea of, what we're going to do. What are you going to do about this? And, we're going to teach courses, but in the context of universities, when, and like, I just want you both to say something more. Like I'm this thing about, don't argue with bullies. But when my students are saying, it's just a white colonialist country. It's just, what strategies are working? Is anybody getting anywhere with countering that beyond just saying, no, that's not right, and just more words? Like,
yeah, but here's the problem. You're saying, how do I defend myself against?
Mhm.
Okay, they say this, how do I answer? Forget about it. You're you don't have anything. What do you say? If you come out and say, Israel is an amazing country because, just out of the blue, or the Jewish tradition is really special because, and you put that out there without any relation to anything, on a bright blue day, on a clear day, that's part of your agenda. You got to build your own agenda. It's true that when you're pinned in a corner by those extremists, you also need to answer. But just turn down the volume. What do you want to say? Good morning, everybody. What do I want to say? What's on my agenda? So I think the problem is that the pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, now it's in one bunch side, doesn't set an agenda.
Yeah.
They don't have their first foot forward. So the best defense is offense. Say what you want to say. Like, I just, was at Oxford and I learned so many interesting things about Jewish history. Now just to say the word Jew and just to say the word Israel is so toxic that if you introduce that in the environment in a casual way, you're gonna drive the extremists crazy, but you're gonna normalize what's becoming abnormal. So I don't want to hear, okay, it's important to know so you feel confident enough to be able to answer that. But don't talk about answering them. Say, what am I going to say? What's my agenda? What am I going to put out today? And every day come and say, what am I going to add to the conversation? Not their conversation, my conversation that I'm starting, that I'm creating, that I have allies or that I know people that are interested in hearing things. What am I going to say to them? And I'm not talking about the extremists. And I would not respond to them directly. You'd say, I would brush them off as the extremists. Well, I don't want to talk to extremists. I want to talk to my friends, my allies, my the people that I can have a normal conversation with. So let's think tabula rasa. Let's not think, how do I defend? Let's not be bunker mentality. Let's say, how do we set our agenda?
So that's a great, Pamela, that's a great recipe for being proactive. When something comes up in a class, I think we also need to know how to be reactive. And one of the things you need to remember is if you look like you are bullying a member of the class, you as the professor are in trouble, because the whole class will unite around the student who has been shut down. I don't know if this is true in universities in Europe, but I can tell you that in the United States, the professor is viewed as somebody with a lot of power, and the students are viewed as people without power. So I think a person has to think about how to answer things and get the information across without looking like you're using your power in a way that's inappropriate. It's very tricky. Yes.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. My question is actually for Jacob, but you can both respond if you
That's
want
okay.
to comment. My question is, I've heard that BDS battle has been won, or not that we're winning, but it has been fought more efficiently through law and through suing these companies and divesting money. So could you please talk more about it? Because I know that here in Europe, they have had amazing ones against BDS. I don't know how much in the US, but I would like to learn more about
Yeah.
that.
So now let's talk, operational, moving out of the academy. The single best method for countering BDS is the legal avenue, period. Legislation, law. By the way, that is the best general method for counteracting chaos and bullies and crime and all that sort of thing, but law. So there are laws on the books, there are new laws, and they have to be enforced. And I think this is a societal problem. We should not feel uncomfortable using the law to our advantage. We should not feel uncomfortable, using legal or administrative, options when it's appropriate. Like, why do we have to be ashamed? Like, sue that. And in the American context, the single biggest, in my view, and it's not only in my view, the single biggest accomplishment of the American Jewish community, and it was by accident accomplishment, was the anti-BDS legislation, unequivocally. Because what happened is there were two cases, very important cases, in both Airbnb and Ben and Jerry's, of companies that started to divest, and these are big companies with big names and with really a lot of public, high public profile, and both decided at a certain point to not continue activities in the Jewish part of the West Bank, or in Jewish-owned thing, and they singled out Jews within a specific geographic area, and that triggered BDS laws, which are in place in about half the states in the United States. Some of those laws are more enforceable in some states, and others they're more rhetorical. But that created a real backlash against those moves, and they created a real deterrence. And in my view, the reason you're not seeing more companies, give in to demands for or kind of open up that avenue is because they see the deterrence factor. The other thing in the United States, the Department of Education, the Civil Rights branch within the Department of Education, has opened up several or is investigating several complaints against universities. That's very important. The way to get the administration to act is either through law or through its donors, and no one should hesitate to use both levers. I mean, if the donors are mad, they should say they're mad, and you should rile them up. because that's the way, you know, you gotta fight. You can't say, oh, well, like, this is already to the point, and as you're describing, or this is like, there's a war going on. I mean, there's stuff's out there. It's not in its infancy. I mean, it's because of the cowardice of the faculty that wouldn't stand up when it wasn't in its infancy that we are here. So now that we are where we are, we don't have to hold back the heavy thing, and the heavy thing is both the economic levers, be it donors of that or the legal levels, and use them, because otherwise you're going to just trample. They're just going to. It's like a stampede. I mean, at this point, it's at the level of a stampede. When you have a situation where BDS Boston is went off the reservation, and BDS in the West Bank is telling them that we were disassociating yourself, then you know something like this is off the rails. So this is off the rails, and in order to sort of get control of it again, you need to use those levers that are most effective, and the legislative the legal lever has put the single most effective lever.
Thank you.
So my question is for Jacob, and to address the question that you brought up, and I apologize, I just had dental work done, so I apologize for my weird diction. But the question of reaching, kind of trying to address the people on the gut level, on the emotional level, I also think that it's really important. We know that Soviet propaganda worked that way. They tried to address that, and they know that by the time the fact checkers show up, it's too late. The impact, the emotional impact is so strong that no amount of fact checking can change that. So, okay, fact checking is important, but what do we do? What kind of messages, what emotions do we target? I mean, I'm thinking about Ben's book. I think that, you know, Jewish pride. Okay, so we're trying to target kind of on the more gut level. West Side Gravy, the song Diaspora, right? That's what else can we do? Because I think what the other side does is they target really strong emotions, right? Anger, outrage, kind of, you know, fear. How can we more intentionally target, you know, the emotional side of things?
Well, I don't want to answer that question. I want to, you know, Sylvia, or anybody in the audience, I think that should turn into a discussion question.
One thing that I would say is that you have to do it both proactively and reactively. So are you talking about a classroom? Are you talking about a classroom? Is your question about?
Well, it's more broadly. I was thinking more about social media, but let's talk about the classroom.
All right. So in the classroom, I think that if one of the goals is to give a more realistic and positive picture of Jews and an awareness of anti-Semitism, that has to be part of when you're thinking about the lesson plans, when you're thinking about a syllabus, how can you work that in from the beginning in ways that make sense for whatever subject you're teaching? And I think that for most subjects, except for maybe chemistry, there are ways to work these materials in, because that allows you to, on a gut level, shape what people think when they think of Jews, how people feel about anti-Semitism, how they recognize anti-Semitism. You can use literature, you can use nonfiction, you can use films, but the main thing is that it should capture their imagination. Once you capture their imagination, you've created a basis upon which you can work. But besides that, you really do also need to think about how to answer challenges. In the classroom, you can't just ignore challenges, but you can, after you've taught for more than a year or two, you can definitely, you'll know what kinds of things are going to come up and figure out a way to respond to it that's going to work with the dynamic of your classroom and that you're comfortable with enough to push on it. Because you're the authority, but on the other hand, you don't want to be perceived as somebody who shuts things down. Which is not acceptable in many university settings. But I really strongly recommend, don't wait to be reactive, be proactive in terms of putting things into the syllabus and in so that you can teach it and frame it the way you want it framed in the beginning.
I think it's also just, we have to be confident in defining our own identities and experience, and we want to empower our allies educate our allies, but with boundaries, to say we want support, but this is what it means to be a Jew. And we're not really willing to, we will explain it, of course, in terms of like, please ask clarifying questions, but we're not willing to debate. There's certain things as a gay man, I would not debate about my identity. Similarly, I would not debate as a Jew. And we as a collective need confidence to say, with all due respect, this is your role to listen to the Jewish experience and the Jewish people and find out what it means to be a Jew and not tell us. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, Israeli music, like everything to normalize. Any other ideas? This is an important conversation that I don't want to, of course, take us too much time, but I want people to maybe to throw out one or two, like, 15-second ideas. Huh? Food. Food, yeah, food. That's good.
I think,
Oh, there's music, yeah.
I mean, besides music, like that's my thing, but I think that industrially something that could be worked on is there's so much Israeli TV. It's not about the conflict. It's about what it's like to regular Israeli people. That's not translated with English subtitles. Like we have like Fauda and all this stuff, which is good, but like there's plenty of shows about like an up and coming Israeli singer from Rosh Hashanah. Like the people in Israel are watching. American Jews should be able to watch that too.
Anything else?
Work more with the communities who actually love Jews and like Israel. And many of them are some of the most persecuted in the world.
Yeah, I think Netflix has been like good for Israel.
Yeah.
Netflix.
Netflix is good, like, not only Chowder, not only Chowder.
Unorthodox, man, Orthodox life. It's horrendous.
Okay, it's a good thing to keep on thinking about. That's it.
Hi. One of the things I wanted to respond to is this increasing problem with the way the supposed whiteness of Jews is being used against Jewish people and against Israel as well. Where is Israel? Israel is in the Middle East. A lot of Jews have returned back to their original homeland. The state was established in 1948. That means in 26 years' time, Israel will be celebrating its centennial. The Abraham Accord gives us a great opportunity to do something, and that's to re-emphasize the Middle Eastern character of Israel. Jewish people today are not just minorities in other countries. You have this, alhamdulillah, powerful state that is developing. As Yossi points out in his book, which I'm reading at the moment, I find it very fascinating. Israel is this strong state in the Middle East that is now creating partnerships. So use that opportunity through the Abraham Accords and the future things that you develop to emphasize the Middle Eastern character of Israel and the shared culture. And there's a lot of shared culture between Israelis. I mean, even, like the kind of, as you said, the foods that you eat, increasingly music, so many different things. And this also helps Israel also create stronger partnerships with its neighbors, which also helps to deal with some of these other BDS issues and stuff, because as people start to realize this is Israel's home. And, it's, as well as that, how many generations are now born in Israel? Exactly. Where are they going to go? I mean, I've been saying for years when people have come to me and says, Israel should be, I said, where are they going to go? These people born there,
There's also been a continuous Jewish presence.
Yeah.
There has. And I'm not taking away from that either, but it's, this is, you got to think creatively how to, like, these people are trying to put you in a box, basically. And I meant that figuratively, but actually, about it, it's quite scary. People want to put me in a box too, especially for, highlighting and encouraging you. But it's like, I mean, yeah. So what you have to do is you have to break out of that box. You have to think out of the box and be creative in the way that you can. And as you said, Sylvia, be creative in the way that you approach things, and proactive. So sorry, that wasn't a question. It was more of a. I hope it's.
It's a Jewish question. Am I right?
Hello, thank you for both of the presentations. One like kind of question I have is regarding like the issue of like race and how the Jewish people are perceived. And one thing that I think within the American Jewish community specifically, we're missing a lot. So there's a huge percentage of Jews in the United States of America who are immigrants, who are coming from, you know, either Iran or like former Soviet Union. And I think that those are people who grew up in societies where there's no such thing as a white Jew or Jew of color in Iran because there's no white people in Iran, like first of all. And then same thing, like when it comes to the Soviet Union, like there's not such thing as like white Jews because the Jews who are there, I mean, were either like Ashkenazi, Bukharian, Kafkazi, but like they were put in opposition to would be our understanding of white people who are like ethnic Russians to stamp on their passport. And I feel like that community has been like kind of ignored and kind of lumped into this white or Jew of color category in the United States. That's not something they would self-identify as. So I'm curious, how do you think it's possible to integrate and empower and listen to people and how they self-identify when it comes to the American Jewish community, and also use that as a bridge to open the conversation about Jewish people as a whole, not fitting into this category of whiteness?
Right, well, the thing I take from it is, you know, there's so much richness and there's so much to show and there's so much to be proud of, that instead of saying, okay, well, how do we counter this narrative? You don't, but just, you know, like, let's show what we've got, you know, and we, again, it's let the Jewish community in this case set the agenda. Let it show its diversity. Let it show its intellectual thing. Let it show its achievements. Let it show its contributions. Let it show, let's be proud. You know, one of the things that the previous ambassador to combat anti-Semitism in the US, he said, you know, one thing is to combat anti-Semitism, but the flip side of that is to create philo-Semitism or love of the Jews. Now that's the part that, you know, people talk about for the last 5 minutes of the talk. And that should be the 65%. Now, again, you need to, and to Sylvia's point, you need to be able to answer the questions in the classroom or wherever they come up. But there's a disproportionate amount of time, you know, spent on how do we tell our story. And I think we've got to look inside, because we've changed a lot. The community is really, the Jewish community is evolving significantly in the United States and in Israel as well. We got to look at ourselves and say, what do we want to say about ourselves? What's our story? And once we come, I want to tell you my story. Foot forward, I think that's where we're going to get our strength. And there's always going to be that extreme, the extremists on the side who's going to make noise. But if we come out to the vast majority of the people and say, here's our story, here's what we have to show, here's what we're proud of, people will listen.
And it's not done all at one time. I think that's important too. You have to remember that things like there are musicians who are now spreading information and singing from Middle Eastern backgrounds, from Sephardic backgrounds. So incorporate that. When you have literature that comes from these other backgrounds, incorporate that. It's not always a frontal presentation. You need to seize the opportunity to share information about the diverse cultures of Judaism, because that will change perceptions as well.
Okay, so on this note, Sylvia and Jacob, thank you so much. And I actually, just very briefly, I like how the conversation went from hate to maybe exploring how we can be proud and understand ourselves better in this world, which is also maybe an important part of our work. So Sylvia, thank you. Jacob, thank you. Enjoy the tea break, and we're back in 27 minutes. Thanks, Sylvia. Okay.
What is it you see there? It's the same thing.